Cables are formed when adjacent groups of 2, 3, or more needles switch needle position on the needle bed. Cables can be made to appear more pronounced by reforming stitches or forming ladders on either side of the cable. In this example, a 2x2 cable will be formed by picking up two groups of 2 stitches and swapping their position on the needle bed. With 2 double prong transfer tools, pick up a group of 4 stitches, 2 on either tool, and move one group to the left and cross the remaining group to the right. Because we're looking at the purl side when working on the knitting machine, the resulting cable is going to be the mirror image in a sense of the way we're crossing it. So whichever group of stitches you put down first will be on the topmost layer of the cable from the knit side. Often it's helpful to pull the needles to hold and knit back from hold to ensure the needles that are quite heavily tensioned by this cable knit off cleanly. Here you can see the cable cross from the purl side and better understand why the first group of stitches that's put down is on the front facing side of the cable. I've knit 4 rows in between each cable cross, but this isn't a rule per se. You can knit any length you wish between crosses. When doing the next cable, cross the same stitches in the same order. By repeating the same steps, this ensures that the cable appears twisted on the knit side of the work. If you were to alternate which group of stitches you put down first every other time you reform the cable, the front cross will always stay on the front and will snake up the cable instead of twisting. Both are valid methods. It depends on the result you're after. Just something to take note of. As a beginner, sometimes it's difficult to read the back of your knitting so that you know which needles you're working across to form your cables. Might be helpful to use the grease pen or marker to mark the metal bit of the needle bed so that you know you're always crossing the same group of stitches. In this example, the 2x2 cable is formed in exactly the same way as the first example. However, here on the left side of the work, I will form rungs on either side of the cable. And on the right-hand side, reform the columns of stitches on the left and right side of the cable to help offset it from the knit background, which will be more apparent when we turn the work over and take a look at the knit side. Again, I'll knit 4 rows between each cable cross. On the left, I don't have to do anything. It's going to continue to form ladders all by itself. But on the right, after every cable cross, I'm going to count down 4 stitches and relatch on either side to put a purl column of stitches on either side of the cable from the knit facing side of the work. You don't have to reform the stitches every time you do the cable cross, but it's nice to not have to reform a huge length of stitches when you finish cabling, say, the entirety of the front of a sweater. Breaking it up into small groups is much easier and will be in the long run more efficient as you're working, building your swatch, garment, panel, etc. On the left side here, because I formed those eyelets in the same row that I crossed the pairs of stitches to cable, they're really tight. You can even see here in the middle, those 2 centermost cabled stitches, when they're pulled to hold, were coming together, not touching, but getting there. It's a good idea if those 2 center needles in any cable do touch or cross over one another or try to hook together, that you pull them back to forward working position before you knit the next row. The last thing you want are two needles getting hung up together when you try to knit across one row and making a mess of everything. You obviously can't push these needles all the way back to working position because since they started in hold, the stitches are behind the latch. If you push them all the way back to work, all your stitches will fly off. After my 4 rows, you can see quite clearly on the left-hand side how those ladders give the cable some space. And on the right-hand side, before I knit or cross the next cable, I'm going to count down those 4 stitches and reform that column of stitches to continue that purl well that'll appear on the knit side of the work all the way up as I work the cable. Cables tend to draw your work in widthwise. This is only made more apparent when you're reforming stitches or even when you're using ladders. And as everything in machine knitting, if you're making a fully cabled garment, your gauge swatch would be a fully cabled gauge swatch so that you were knitting appropriately to spec. However, if you last minute decide to add a couple cables across the front of your sweater, the general rule of thumb is to add an additional stitch or 2 for each cable you cross along the width. This doesn't mean increase on the same row that you make the cable, but begin with those extra stitches for all of the cables that you plan to knit. This negates, to a degree, that widthwise reduction. Of course, one cable might not make a significant difference, but each instance of each cable only amplifies the degree in which the work will draw in overall.